What happens when a father who abandoned his son returns after 25 years? Ethan Hayes was only 5 when his father vanished, leaving behind unanswered questions and a heart filled with sorrow. Years later, now a successful lawyer, Ethan finds himself face to face with the man who disappeared without a trace. In a courtroom filled with tension, shocking revelations come to light, and the true reasons behind Daniel's disappearance unfold. The last memory Ethan had of his father was the sound of the front door closing behind him. He was only 5 years old, standing in the dimly lit hallway of their modest home, clutching a worn-out teddy bear to his chest. His father, Daniel, had just kissed him on the forehead, whispered something Ethan couldn't quite understand, and then disappeared into the night. The door clicked shut, and with it, so did the chapter of Ethan's life that included a father. Ethan's mother, Laura, was left to pick up the pieces. She worked tirelessly, juggling 2 jobs to make ends meet. The small house felt emptier without Daniel's presence, and the silence at the dinner table was often filled with Laura's tired sighs and Ethan's unspoken questions. Where did he go? Why did he leave? These thoughts plagued Ethan, but he rarely voiced them, sensing the pain it caused his mother. As Ethan grew older, the void left by his father's absence became a part of him. It was an unspoken shadow that followed him through school, where he excelled in his studies, perhaps driven by a subconscious desire to prove his worth. Laura often told him how proud his father would be, but the words felt hollow, like echoes in an empty room. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Laura looked up from her paperwork and met Ethan's eyes. "You know, your father loved you very much," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. Ethan frowned, setting down his pen. "Then why did he leave, Mom? Why did he just disappear?" Laura sighed, her eyes reflecting years of sorrow and resilience. "He had his reasons, Ethan. Reasons I don't fully understand. But he did what he thought was best for us." Ethan wanted to press further, to demand answers, but he saw the weariness in his mother's eyes and decided against it. Instead, he channeled his frustration and confusion into his studies, developing a keen interest in law. He was determined to seek justice, not just for himself, but for others who had been abandoned or wronged. Years passed, and Ethan graduated at the top of his class, eventually landing a prestigious position at a law firm. He specialized in family law, often taking on cases that mirrored his own troubled past. Despite his professional success, the unresolved mystery of his father's disappearance lingered in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of unfinished business. One rainy afternoon, as Ethan was preparing to leave the office, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello, this is Ethan. Mr. Ethan Hayes," a woman's voice inquired. "Yes, speaking. How can I help you?" "My name is Alice Thompson. I'm a probate attorney and I'm handling a case involving your father, Daniel Hayes." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't heard that name in years, not since the night Daniel walked out of their lives. "My father? What is this about?" "There's a probate hearing scheduled and it involves your father's estate. He's been living under an assumed name and his whereabouts were recently discovered. You're named in the will." Ethan felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Anger, curiosity, and a long-buried hope all fought for dominance. "When is the hearing?" "Next week, Wednesday, at the county courthouse. I can send you the details." "Please do," Ethan replied, his mind racing. "Thank you." He hung up, staring at his phone in disbelief. Daniel Hayes, the man who had abandoned him and his mother, was alive. And now, after all these years, he was being summoned to court for a probate case. It felt surreal, like a chapter of his life that he thought was closed had suddenly reopened. The days leading up to the hearing were a blur of emotions. Ethan replayed old memories in his mind, trying to make sense of his father's disappearance. He confided in Laura, who listened with a mix of surprise and apprehension. "I never expected to hear his name again," she admitted. "Are you sure you want to go?" "I need answers, Mom," Ethan said firmly. "I need to know why he left us." When the day of the hearing arrived, Ethan dressed meticulously, his mind focused on the task ahead. As he walked into the courthouse, he felt a mixture of anticipation and dread. The courtroom was filled with a hushed tension. the kind that precedes significant events. Ethan took a seat, scanning the room until his eyes landed on an older man sitting across from him. It took a moment for him to recognize the features that had changed with age, but there was no mistaking it. Daniel Hayes, his father. Daniel looked up, and their eyes met. There was a flicker of recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the shared past between them. Ethan felt a lump in his throat, memories flooding back, but he maintained his composure. The judge entered, and the hearing began. Ethan listened intently as the probate attorney outlined the case. Daniel had been living under the name Richard Thompson and had accumulated a modest estate. In his will, he had named Ethan as the primary beneficiary. "Mr. Hayes, would you like to address the court?" the judge asked. Daniel stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. "Yes, Your Honor. I would." Ethan leaned forward, every nerve on edge. He was finally going to hear his father's side of the story. "I left my family because I thought it was the only way to protect them," Daniel began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was in debt to dangerous people. They threatened my family's safety. Leaving was the hardest decision I ever made, but I believed it was the only way to keep them safe." Ethan felt a surge of anger. "And you thought disappearing without a word was the best way to handle it?" he muttered under his breath. Daniel continued, his gaze unwavering. "I changed my name, moved to a different state, and tried to build a new life while keeping an eye on my family from a distance. I know it was cowardly, and I regret it every day. But I never stopped loving you or your mother." The courtroom was silent as Daniel's words hung in the air. Ethan felt a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a glimmer of understanding. He had spent years resenting his father, but now, hearing the truth, he realized how complicated the situation had been. The hearing concluded with the judge approving the probate, but for Ethan, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. He stood up, walking towards Daniel, who looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. "Ethan," Daniel said softly, his voice breaking, "I'm so sorry." Ethan took a deep breath, the weight of the past pressing down on him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "There's a lot we need to discuss." As they left the courtroom together, the rain began to fall, mirroring the turbulent emotions between them. But for the first time in years, there was a possibility of healing, of finding answers, and maybe even forgiveness. The vanishing act was over. Now it was time to face the reality of what had been lost and what could be regained. The rain poured steadily as Ethan and Daniel walked out of the courthouse. Ethan's mind was a storm of emotions, each drop echoing his confusion and frustration. They found shelter under a nearby awning, the silence between them almost palpable. Daniel glanced at Ethan, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and hope. "Can we go somewhere to talk?" Daniel asked quietly. Ethan hesitated before nodding. "There's a coffee shop around the corner. We can talk there." They walked in silence, each step bringing them closer to a conversation that was 25 years overdue. The coffee shop was a cozy place, filled with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. They found a secluded corner, away from the curious glances of other patrons. Ethan ordered 2 black coffees, his usual choice, while Daniel asked for the same. Once the steaming mugs were placed before them, Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying the man before him. Time had etched lines on Daniel's face and his hair was streaked with gray, but his eyes, those same eyes Ethan remembered from childhood, held a depth of sorrow and a glimmer of hope. "So," Ethan began, his voice steady but guarded, "you changed your name to Richard Thompson and started a new life. Why didn't you ever contact us?" Daniel sighed, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "I thought about it countless times, but every time I got close, I backed out. I was ashamed, Ethan. I had made such a mess of things, and I didn't want to drag you and your mother back into that chaos." "But you did," Ethan replied, his tone sharper than he intended. "You left us to deal with everything on our own. Do you have any idea what that did to Mom? To me?" Daniel's shoulders slumped. "I can imagine, and it haunts me every day. I've spent the last 25 years living with that guilt. I tried to keep tabs on you from a distance. I saw you graduate, saw you become a lawyer. I was proud of you, Ethan, more than you can imagine." Ethan's anger flared. "Proud? You were proud of me? You weren't there. You weren't there for any of it." The emotion in Ethan's voice caught the attention of a few customers nearby. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. Daniel reached across the table, but Ethan pulled back, the gesture too little, too late. "Ethan, I know I can't make up for the past, but I want to try," Daniel said softly. "I want to explain everything if you'll let me." Ethan studied his father's face, searching for sincerity. He saw the pain and regret in Daniel's eyes, and it mirrored some of his own. "All right," Ethan said finally. "Start from the beginning. I want to know everything." Daniel nodded, taking a sip of his coffee before beginning. "When you were 5, I was in deep trouble. I'd borrowed money from the wrong people, dangerous people. They started threatening our family. I didn't know what to do. I was scared. I thought the only way to protect you and your mother was to disappear, to take myself out of the equation." Ethan listened, his anger slowly being replaced by a deep sadness. "Why didn't you go to the police?" "I was afraid they wouldn't be able to protect us," Daniel admitted, "and I didn't want to risk them coming after you or Laura. I thought by leaving I could keep you both safe. It was a cowardly decision, and I see that now. I've had years to think about it, and I regret not finding another way." There was a long silence as Ethan processed his father's words. He felt a strange mix of empathy and resentment. The story made sense, but it didn't erase the years of absence and the pain that came with it. "What happened after you left?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now. "I moved to another state, changed my name, and tried to start over," Daniel explained. "I found a job, kept a low profile. I followed your life from a distance, always wanting to come back, but never having the courage. When I got sick a few years ago, I realized I couldn't put it off any longer. I needed to make things right before it was too late." "Sick?" Ethan's eyes widened with concern. Daniel nodded. "I had a heart condition. I've been in and out of the hospital, and it made me realize how much time I had lost. I didn't want to leave this world without trying to fix what I'd broken." Ethan felt a pang of sympathy, but it was mixed with lingering anger. "And now you're here, trying to make amends. Do you really think it's that simple?" "No," Daniel said quietly. "I know it's not simple. I know it will take time, and it may never be enough. But I have to try. I owe that to you and your mother." Ethan looked down at his coffee, the steam swirling in the air. He thought about his mother, about the years of hardship they had endured together. He thought about his own struggles, the moments when he had needed a father and found only an empty space where Daniel should have been. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Ethan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm willing to listen. I want to understand, even if it doesn't change what happened." Daniel nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "That's all I can ask for, Ethan. Thank you." They sat in silence for a while, the tension slowly easing. It was a fragile beginning, a small step toward healing the deep wounds of the past. Ethan knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a possibility that the shadows of the past could be faced and maybe, just maybe, overcome. As they left the coffee shop, the rain had stopped and the sky was beginning to clear. It was a small symbolic moment, but it gave Ethan a sense of cautious optimism. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but at least now, it was a journey they could begin together. The following week, Ethan found himself back at the courthouse, but this time he wasn't alone. His mother Laura had agreed to accompany him, her presence a quiet pillar of support. They walked side by side, the weight of the past heavy between them. Ethan glanced at her, noting the determined set of her jaw and the way her eyes scanned their surroundings as if looking for ghosts. "I still can't believe he's alive," Laura murmured as they approached the courtroom. "Neither can I," Ethan admitted. "But we need answers. We deserve that much." Inside, the courtroom was filled with a hushed tension. Ethan's gaze swept the room until he found Daniel, seated at the front with his attorney. Daniel looked up as they entered, his eyes softening when he saw Laura. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, her expression unreadable. The judge called the session to order, and the probate attorney began outlining the case. Ethan tried to focus on the legal jargon, but his mind kept drifting back to the man sitting across the room, his father who had abandoned them and now was back, seeking some form of redemption. "Mr. Hayes," the judge said, turning to Daniel, "please take the stand." Daniel rose slowly, walking to the witness stand. He looked older, more fragile than Ethan remembered. As he took his seat, he glanced at Ethan and Laura, a flicker of emotion crossing his face. "Mr. Hayes," the judge began, "you've contested the probate of your estate. Please explain your reasons to the court." Daniel cleared his throat, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Your Honor, I left my family 25 years ago under circumstances I believed were necessary to protect them. I've recently been diagnosed with a terminal illness, and I want to ensure that my estate goes to my son, Ethan, as a means of making amends for my absence." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't known about the terminal diagnosis. It added a new layer to the already complex emotions he was grappling with. "Can you elaborate on why you left and the steps you took afterward?" the judge asked. Daniel nodded, his eyes briefly meeting Ethan's before he began. "I was in debt to dangerous people who threatened my family's safety. I believe the only way to protect them was to disappear, to remove myself from their lives entirely. I changed my name, moved to a different state, and started over. It was a cowardly decision, one I've regretted every day since." Laura's hand tightened on Ethan's arm, her expression a mix of anger and pain. Ethan placed his hand over hers, offering silent support as they listened to Daniel's testimony. "I kept tabs on my family from a distance," Daniel continued. "I saw Ethan grow up, saw him graduate, become a lawyer. I was proud, but I knew I couldn't return without risking their safety. It was only when I became ill that I realized I couldn't leave this world without trying to make things right." The courtroom was silent as Daniel's words hung in the air. The judge studied him for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Hayes, your actions have had profound effects on your family. This court will take into consideration your testimony when making a decision. You may step down." Daniel returned to his seat, his shoulders slumped as if the weight of his confession had drained him. Ethan's mind raced with thoughts and emotions, trying to process everything he had heard. The judge turned to Ethan. "Mr. Hayes, do you have anything you wish to say?" Ethan stood, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on him. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Your Honor, I spent most of my life wondering why my father left us. His absence shaped who I am today in ways both good and bad. Hearing his side of the story doesn't erase the pain, but it does provide some understanding. I believe in justice and fairness, and while I can't forgive him easily, I think it's important that his wishes are honored, given the circumstances." The judge nodded, acknowledging Ethan's words. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. We will now take a short recess before delivering a decision." As the judge left the bench, Ethan turned to his mother. "Are you okay?" Laura nodded, though her eyes were filled with unshed tears. "I never thought I'd see him again, much less hear him admit to everything." Ethan squeezed her hand. "It's a lot to take in, but we'll get through this together." After the recess, the court reconvened. The judge took his seat and looked at the assembled parties. After considering the testimony and evidence presented, this court rules in favor of the probate. The estate of Daniel Hayes will be transferred to his son, Ethan Hayes, as per the terms of the will. There was a collective exhale in the courtroom, a release of the tension that had built up over the course of the hearing. Ethan felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The legal matter was settled, but the personal journey was just beginning. As they exited the courthouse, Daniel approached Ethan and Laura. He looked at Laura first, his expression one of deep remorse. "Laura, I know I can never make up for what I did, but I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Laura's gaze was steady, though her voice trembled slightly. "It's going to take time, Daniel. A lot of time." Daniel nodded, accepting her words. He then turned to Ethan, who met his eyes with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "Ethan, I'd like to get to know you again, if you're willing. I understand if you need time, but I'm here for as long as I have left." Ethan felt a surge of conflicting emotions. He wanted to lash out, to demand why it had taken so long. But he also felt a small spark of hope, a chance for closure, and maybe even healing. "We'll see, Dad. One step at a time." As they parted ways, Ethan walked with Laura, their steps in sync. The shadows of the past still loomed, but there was a path forward, a chance to navigate the complexities of their shared history. Ethan knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of direction, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal. The weeks following the court hearing were a whirlwind of emotions for Ethan. He found himself thinking constantly about his father, the years of silence between them, and the fragile path toward reconciliation. Despite his initial hesitation, Ethan decided to meet with Daniel again, determined to seek the answers he still desperately needed. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, Ethan drove to the modest apartment where Daniel now lived. The building was old but well kept, and as Ethan climbed the stairs, he felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it opened to reveal Daniel, looking both surprised and hopeful. "Ethan," Daniel greeted, his voice warm yet cautious. "Come in, please." Ethan stepped inside, taking in the small but tidy living space. It was filled with simple furniture and personal touches, a few photographs, some old books, and a quilt draped over the sofa. Daniel motioned for Ethan to sit, and they settled into chairs facing each other. "I appreciate you coming," Daniel began, his eyes searching Ethan's face for any sign of how this meeting might go. "I needed to talk," Ethan replied, his tone measured. "There are still so many things I don't understand." Daniel nodded, leaning forward slightly. "Ask me anything, Ethan. I'll answer as honestly as I can." Ethan took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Why didn't you try to come back sooner? Even if it was dangerous, couldn't you have found a way to contact us, to let us know you were alive?" Daniel's expression grew pained. "I thought about it every day, but every time I considered reaching out, I convinced myself it was too risky. I was afraid that if the wrong people found out I was alive, they'd come after you and your mother. I thought staying away was the best way to protect you." "But you left us with nothing," Ethan said, his voice rising slightly. "We struggled for years. Mom worked herself to the bone to keep us afloat. Do you know how many times I wished I could talk to you, to ask for your help or advice?" Daniel's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I know I failed you both. I was a coward, and I made terrible choices. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I only caused more pain." Ethan felt a lump in his throat, the raw emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He took a moment to compose himself before speaking again. "Tell me about the people you were involved with. Who were they, and why were they so dangerous?" Daniel sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as if the memories were physically painful. "I got involved with a loan shark, a man named Victor. He was connected to some very dangerous people, organized crime. I borrowed money to keep our business afloat, but when I couldn't repay it, they started making threats. I knew they were serious, and I didn't see a way out. I thought disappearing would be the best solution. Did you ever consider going to the police?" Ethan asked, his curiosity piqued by the mention of organized crime. "I did," Daniel admitted, "but I was afraid they wouldn't be able to protect us, or that Victor would find out and retaliate. It seemed like too big a risk at the time. I realize now that it was a mistake, but back then I was desperate and scared." Ethan nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. He could see the fear and regret in his father's eyes, and it softened his anger, if only slightly. "What about now? Are you still in danger?" Daniel shook his head. "Victor was arrested years ago, and most of his associates are either in prison or have moved on. I kept a low profile to stay off their radar, but I don't think they're a threat anymore. My illness made me realize I needed to make things right, no matter the risk." Ethan absorbed this information, his mind racing with thoughts of the past and the future. He could see the genuine remorse in his father's eyes, and it stirred something within him, a reluctant but growing sense of empathy. "Ethan," Daniel said softly, breaking the silence, "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to make the most of whatever time we have left. I want to get to know you again, to be a part of your life, if you'll let me." Ethan looked at his father, the man who had caused him so much pain, but who was now seeking redemption. It was a lot to process, and he wasn't sure he was ready to forgive entirely, but he felt a glimmer of hope, a possibility that they could rebuild something from the ruins of their past. "I want that too," Ethan said finally, his voice filled with both resolve and vulnerability. But it's going to take time. I need to see that you're committed to this, that you're willing to put in the effort to make things right. Daniel's eyes shone with gratitude. I understand, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes. Thank you, Ethan. I've missed you more than you'll ever know. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. It was a tentative beginning, but it was a start. Ethan knew that the road ahead would be long and challenging, but for the first time, he felt a sense of possibility, a chance to heal the wounds that had festered for so long. As the afternoon light began to fade, Ethan stood to leave. Daniel walked into the door, a mixture of hope and apprehension in his eyes. I'll call you, Ethan said, his voice steady. We'll take it one step at a time. Daniel nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. One step at a time. Thank you, Ethan. As Ethan walked back to his car, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they seemed less daunting now, more like echoes than insurmountable barriers. He knew the journey ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time. Over the next few months, Ethan and Daniel cautiously began to rebuild their relationship. They met regularly, each visit peeling back layers of pain and misunderstanding. Ethan learned about the life Daniel had led in his absence, how he had struggled with guilt and isolation, how he had quietly celebrated Ethan's milestones from afar. In turn, Daniel heard about the challenges Ethan and Laura had faced, the void his absence had left in their lives, and the resilience that had carried them through. One evening, as summer began to wane, Ethan invited Daniel to dinner at his apartment. It was a modest place, filled with the warm, lived-in feel of someone who had built a life of his own. As Daniel arrived, he looked around, a mixture of pride and sorrow in his eyes. Nice place, Ethan, Daniel said, offering a tentative smile. Thanks, Dad. Ethan replied, the words still feeling strange on his tongue but slowly becoming more natural. Come on in. Dinner's almost ready. They sat at the small dining table, the aroma of roasted chicken and vegetables filling the room. Conversation flowed more easily now, each of them growing more comfortable in the presence of the other. They talked about work, about mutual interests, and about the memories that had shaped them. After dinner, they moved to the living room, sipping on coffee as the evening light filtered through the windows. There was a comfortable silence between them, one that spoke of healing and unspoken understanding. I want to thank you, Ethan, Daniel said suddenly, breaking the silence, for giving me this chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful every day that you're willing to let me back into your life. Ethan looked at his father, seeing the sincerity and regret in his eyes. It hasn't been easy, Dad. There's still a lot we need to work through, but I've come to realize that holding on to the past only keeps us trapped. If we're going to move forward, we need to forgive, not just each other, but ourselves. Daniel nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. You're right, and I want you to know, Ethan, that I'm committed to this, to being here, to making things right, for as long as I have left. Ethan's heart ached at the reminder of his father's illness, but he felt a deep sense of resolve. We'll take it one day at a time, that's all we can do. As the evening grew late, Daniel prepared to leave. They stood by the door, the weight of the past lightened by the promise of a new beginning. Good night, Dad, Ethan said, his voice steady and filled with hope. Good night, son, Daniel replied, his smile warm and genuine. Days turned into weeks, and their relationship continued to grow. They shared more about their lives, their hopes, and their fears. Ethan introduced Daniel to his friends, bringing him into the fold of his world. Laura, too, began to soften her interactions with Daniel, becoming more frequent and less strained. There was a cautious but undeniable rebuilding of their family. One sunny afternoon, Ethan decided to take Daniel on a drive to the coast. It was a place Ethan had always found solace, the vast expanse of the ocean offering a sense of peace and perspective. As they drove, the conversation was light, filled with laughter and shared memories. When they arrived, they walked along the shore, the sound of the waves providing a soothing backdrop. They found a spot on a rocky outcrop, sitting side by side as they watched the sun dip toward the horizon. This place is beautiful, Daniel remarked, his eyes reflecting the colors of the setting sun. It's always been a favorite of mine, Ethan replied. Whenever I needed to think, I'd come here. It's where I feel closest to everything." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the moment shared without the need for words. Finally, Ethan turned to his father, a question that had been lingering on his mind rising to the surface. "Dad, do you ever think about what could have been? If things had been different?" Daniel sighed, his gaze distant. "All the time, I've imagined countless scenarios where I made better choices, where I didn't run. But dwelling on the past won't change it. All we can do is move forward, make the most of the time we have." Ethan nodded, the wisdom of his father's words resonating deeply. "You're right, and I'm glad we're finding our way back to each other. It's been a long journey, but I'm hopeful." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the water, Ethan felt a sense of peace wash over him. The path to healing was still ongoing, but they were on it together. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the past lifting, replaced by the promise of a future filled with understanding and love. As they headed back to the car, Daniel put his arm around Ethan's shoulders, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. It was a sign of the bond they were rebuilding, a bond that, despite its fractures, was stronger for having been mended. "Thank you, Ethan," Daniel said softly, "for giving us this chance." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Thank you, Dad, for being here." They drove back in contented silence, the road ahead filled with possibility. The journey of reconciliation was far from over, but they had made significant strides. Together they had faced the shadows of the past, and together they were moving toward a brighter, more hopeful future. As Ethan lay in bed that night, he reflected on the day and the progress they had made. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the chance to heal, for the opportunity to rebuild, and for the unexpected gift of time with his father. It was a reminder that even in the face of pain and loss, there was always hope for redemption and renewal. And so, as the night settled in, Ethan closed his eyes, ready to embrace the new day with an open heart and a spirit of forgiveness. The healing path was not an easy one, but it was a path he was no longer walking alone, and for that he was profoundly grateful.